This talk is partially inspired by a paper by Renato Renner and his PhD student, Daniela Fraschiger, if I'm saying her name correctly. They proved something they think of as a no-go theorem for single world views of quantum mechanics. And the way they structure the paper is that they give three conditions that one might take on their views on quantum mechanics, and then they show that the three views are in contradiction. The way this is inspired by that is that when Renato and Daniela wrote some explanation of what it is that's going on in other interpretations that aren't forced to a many worlds interpretation. And their usual story, as I understood it in the paper, was that if you are still a single world interpretation, then you've violated one of our three conditions, and it depends upon which interpretation you have denied. Maybe I shouldn't say violated. So when I looked at the three conditions, I thought condition one isn't really well posed in QBism. So I guess we're denying that one. And condition two isn't really well posed in QBism. So I guess we're denying that one too. And condition three wasn't posed at all in QBism. So we were denying that one. So it seemed that we were just falling out of the framework of the no-go theorem that they wanted to prove. And consequently, I tried to encode why we didn't fall into any of the three categories or any of the three assumptions in Renato's paper. And I titled them Tenets of QBism. It was an email, and because it was an email, I turned it into a paper. And now I'm turning it into a talk. What I'm going to attempt to do is present a view that I believe is held by the players on this page. I'm up at the top left. Down here is my postdoc, Blake Stacy. There's Rudiger Schock, you all know. David Merman at the far right. My PhD student, John DeBroda, who's in the audience and who will be accepting all of the tough questions that you might give me. And QBism the dog.
QBism
now,
the dog.
We're not completely sure he agrees with all of these tenets of QBism, but he speaks in binary, and it's difficult to get past him. The Cubist painting that you see in front of you is by Jean Metzinger, I think 1912, and QBism as a doctrine has decided to adopt this painting as our symbol. The reason for that is, as we were writing our Wikipedia article for QBism, someone pointed out that Niels Bohr had an interest in QBism. And if you go to the Niels Bohr Wikipedia page, you'll see a Jean Metzinger painting that he had in his study. So I thought if Niels Bohr could have a Cubist painting, the Cubist should have a Cubist painting. So we both have Metzinger. I would normally tell you, if you really want to know something more deeply about QBism, you should go read some of these articles. But the years have gone by, and I don't have to just rely on our own writing anymore. Richard Healy has written an excellent article for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it is a lot more compact than anything in nearly any one of my papers, but he gets all of the essential points. I might also point you to the Wikipedia article that, at least as of today, is a pretty good article because it had been constructed by John DeBroda. Oh, can I reveal this? Most of it's been constructed by two anonymous users named Patchworld and Zoreaster. But as David Merman has pointed out, writing on Wikipedia is like writing on water. You know, anything that you write can disappear at any time. So anyway, I want to tell you something about this point of view called QBism and try to encode 4 tenets of it And then whenever I get to a page that says tenet number 1 or tenet number 2, those of you who've seen me speak in the last 20 years can wake up and say, oh, maybe here's something new on this page. And then for all the pages in between, you might just say, oh, there's Chris again. So let's try to go at it. QBism. What the heck is it? It found its original motivation in something. It found its original motivation by Rudiger Schack and I going to work for Carlton Caves, and Carlton Caves being a fan of E.T. Jaynes. Jaynes has this lovely quote, "Our present quantum mechanical formalism is a peculiar mixture describing in part laws of nature, in part incomplete human information about nature, all scrambled up together by Bohr into an omelet that nobody has seen how to unscramble. Yet we think the unscrambling is a prerequisite for any further advance in basic physical theory. For if we cannot separate the subjective and objective aspects of the formalism, we cannot know what we were talking about. It is just that simple." So Jaynes laid down the law for us, and we found this so reasonable we thought it's right. That quantum mechanics is some kind of mixture of subjective elements and objective elements, and it's hard to say which are which. And so we devoted our time to trying to separate them, just as Jaynes had said. And then we started to notice that there were certain fruits of this process. The first fruits were that it had an immediate explanatory power for a number of quantum phenomena. So you've got to realize this was in the early 90s, and people were saying things like the no-cloning theorem is the deepest principle of quantum theory, perhaps the principle from which we can reconstruct the whole theory. And that all seemed believable, but Asher Perez particularly had been leaning on the idea that one shouldn't compare quantum states to points on phase space, but rather one should compare quantum states to Liouville distributions on phase space. And I was thinking, oh, he's right. That's got to have some consequences. What consequence could it have? What consequence could it have? And I was reviewing Liouville's theorem and learning that it preserved phase space volume, it dawned on me that if one were talking about Liouville distributions, there would be a no-cloning theorem for Liouville distributions, just like there is for quantum states. So all of a sudden, rather than the no-cloning theorem seeming like some very deep and mysterious property of quantum mechanics, it seemed to be a trivial consequence of quantum states being like Liouville distributions, being states of knowledge or information. So there was an example where there was an immediate explanatory power. Similarly, one could come up with a story of quantum teleportation that was just about the same. Quantum teleportation didn't seem so mysterious anymore. One could talk about Einstein's concerns with locality. That all started to make sense. And so here was this philosophy. Quantum mechanics is a mixture of subjective and objective. Our task as physicists should be to pull it apart. And if we pull the objective and the subjective pieces apart, we'll get a better understanding. And we thought that this was evidence of that. We kept pursuing that kind of program, and it ultimately, fortunately, I have to admit to my philosophical friends in the audience, sometimes I say unfortunately, led me to lots of philosophy of physics meetings where I met various characters of good stripe and bad stripe. And here's something Tim Maudlin is apt to say. What Bell proved, and what theoretical physics has not yet properly absorbed, is that the physical world itself is non-local. Now, this is something, actually, that confused David Mermin for many years. But if one took a strict QBist understanding of quantum theory, we would say, well, Bell didn't prove that at all. What Bell proved was something, and if you interpret physical theories in a certain way, then that something supports what Tim Maudlin says. But if you view physical theories, particularly quantum mechanics, in another way, then what Bell proved didn't support what Tim Maudlin said. So anyway, that's by way of introduction. The theme of QBism is this. It's to separate the subjective from the objective in quantum theory. And I would say that the statements really boils down to this. In QBism, some, in fact most elements of the formalism indeed are subjective. They're more subjective than you've ever seen anyone talk about. And I think this leads us to a lot of criticism. So Travis Norson, Nicolas Gissen, Wayne Mervold will often call us solipsists. You know, you've given up on the world completely because of all of the subjective elements. But we would say, whereas some relations in the formalism are indeed objective. As objective as anyone could want of a physical theory, they're the theory's direct confrontation with reality. Notice the distinction. QBism is about saying that some elements are subjective, or if one even wanted, we were talking about this at lunch, if one wanted to say that there are instrumental elements within quantum theory, QBism would say, yes, there are instrumental elements within quantum theory. Things like quantum states and quantum operations fit in that vein. But we would say that there are other parts that seem to be directly statements about reality as it is, regardless of a subjective agent. So the distinction is elements versus relations. And as this talk goes on, I'll try to exhibit something about how that goes. So let me go into the tenets of QBism, at least the 4 that I was able to count. We have a collaborator and friend, Marcus Appleby, who once broke QBism up into 20 distinct statements. And he could agree with 19 of them. So he was calling himself a 19th, 20th QBist. Tenet number 1, the Born rule, the foundation of what quantum theory means for QBism, is a normative statement. It is about the decision-making behavior any individual agent should strive for. It is not a descriptive law of nature in the usual sense. Let me try to give you a sense of what I would mean by a normative statement and why it's not a physical law in the usual sense. To give you a feeling for that, I'm first going to talk about probability theory independently of quantum theory. In Di Finetti's point of view about probability theory, a probability is, so if someone like Stefano writes down a probability for something, what he is expressing in a very direct way is how he would be willing to gamble on the event. So the meaning of probability for Di Finetti is just simply this. You imagine that there's a lottery where tickets are sold that are worth $1 if some event E occurs. If you are willing to buy or sell that ticket, if you find this exchangeable for this amount of money, you'd either buy it for that amount of money or you would sell it for that amount of money. If you would be willing to make a contract like that, then Di Finetti would say, your personal probability for this ticket is that amount of money. Here's what's key about that idea. If this is what one means about probability, if this one is what one means by the very concept, then a second person might not be willing to pay the same amount for the same ticket. Maybe that person just says, no, that's too much money for that horse race, and I'm not going to pay it. Two different agents, two different gambling agents, can have two different probabilities. Which one is right and which one is wrong? Di Finetti would say there is no sense, there is no independent criterion for saying which one is right and which one is wrong. It's just someone's opinion. It's how much they're willing to commit. So this is the idea of probability, but someone would say, oh, but probability is a lot more than that. There are laws of probability theory. Students have a hard time getting through the classes. It's a great art, and you've got to prove theorems. Where does all of that structure come from? Di Finetti said that you can get it all, and in fact he proved that you can get it all by making a normative rule. The normative rule is never declare a probability P sub E, or a probability of not E, or a probability of E or F. Never declare probabilities or gambling commitments that will lead to a sure loss. So if you say, look, I'm going to make P sub E a negative number, what that would mean is that you would go to the bookie and say, here, take this ticket off my hands, and I'll pay you this much money. Then you're sure to lose money because you've paid someone to take the lottery ticket off of your hands. So that rule tells you can't have negative numbers as probabilities. You can give a similar argument to show that you can't have numbers that are greater than 1. You shouldn't be willing to buy a $1 ticket for more than $1. You can get all of the rules of probability theory. You can get, for instance, the additivity of probabilities. So if you have E and F that are mutually exclusive, I'm not going to give you the little argument, but you can prove that if P of E or F does not equal P of E plus P of F, then by a combination of buying and selling those tickets, you will surely lose money just in a single event. This is not about gambling in the long run or gambling on many, many trials, but just in one single event. And you get all of probability theory this way. Now, I call it normative. Well, it's because it's this. Here's the way Dennis Lindley put it. The Bayesian, subjectivist, or coherent paradigm is egocentric. It is a tale of one person contemplating the world and not wishing to be stupid, or technically incoherent. He realizes that to do this, his statements of uncertainties must obey the usual rules of probability. So in this sort of game, if I'm a gambling agent, I might say, well, I'm willing to pay a certain amount of money for this one, and I'm willing to pay a certain amount of money for that one, and a different amount of money for that one. If those numbers don't add up in this way, then I'm being stupid. I can lose money for sure, or will lose money for sure. It doesn't tell me, probability theory doesn't tell me what number I should put here. And it doesn't tell me what number I should put there or what number I should put there. It just says that they had better satisfy a certain relation. The relation it should satisfy is an objective feature of probability theory. If we're users of probability theory, we'd better satisfy this relation. But in the Di Finetti view, the term on the left side is subjective. Each term on the right side is subjective. It's the relation that's objective. But it's a normative relation. You may or may not be able to satisfy it with your probabilities. And the reason for that is I considered two events, E and F, E or F. But the truth is E and F are embedded in a third larger set of events. We might say, well, I'm gambling on the horse. My probabilities are about horse races. But also there's a factor about whether it will rain tomorrow. And maybe I would gamble differently if it's going to rain or if it's not going to rain. I'd better take into account the probability assignment I have for rain. And, while I'm doing that, I should take into account my probability assignment that the taxis will get me to the horse race on time, and so forth. So for any finite set of events, they're really enmeshed in potentially infinite number of events. Can I be coherent about my gambling on an infinite number of events? Well, without infinite computational power, I generally can't be. Or if I don't have time to make my decisions, if I don't have time to make a big computation before it's time to put down the money, generally I won't be coherent. It's just something that I strive for, perhaps never achieving. Okay, that's a key point. Because now I want to take that idea and bring it into quantum theory. In quantum theory, we have quantum states and we have measurements, and we can do things like this. Suppose I consider making a measurement on some qubit who has a quantum state like this, and I look at the expectations, my expectations for the value of sigma x measurement, my expectations for the sigma y measurement, my expectations from the sigma z measurement. I can use the given quantum state to calculate these four numbers. But suppose I gave you these four numbers and said, find the quantum state that has these expectations. Well, since these operators are linearly independent and they span the space of operators, if you give me those four expectation values, I can find a quantum state. Okay, in the real world, what you have are the expectation values, not the quantum state. You only get the quantum state in a textbook where they say, suppose the quantum state is. In the real world, you've got expectations about various things. And the Born rule, if we think about it in normative terms, it says, take your probability assignments and turn them into a quantum state. That's useful to you because now, for instance, you might imagine measuring not in the x direction or the y direction or the z direction, but let's say a fourth direction, not previously considered. Then the Born rule tells you exactly how to gamble on the outcomes in the fourth direction. The way the Born rule is normative is if you throw away the structure of quantum theory, you might ask yourself, oh, how would I gamble for a spin in the x measurement? How would I gamble in y? How would I gamble in z? My eyes are closed, notice. I don't have the theory in front of me to look at. And then I say, oh, how would I gamble in the fourth direction? Now let me see if I can find a quantum state that satisfies all of those four probability assignments. If I can't find a quantum state that satisfies those four assignments, quantum theory is instructing me that I've done something wrong. It doesn't tell me how to fix my probabilities. It doesn't tell me which are the right ones, but it tells me that my four probabilities are not in the right relation to each other. So the first tenet of QBism is that quantum theory, like probability theory, is normative. It's a set of rules that help you make better gambles in this world with a certain property that forces this upon us. But look at the Born rule, the way it's usually put. You're given a quantum state and you're given a measurement operator, and you calculate a probability from it. That doesn't at all look like a normative rule. You see a probability on the left side, that's something that Di Finetti would say is set normatively. But on the right side, you've got these other objects. You've got quantum states and you've got measurement operators. If you look at this expression of the Born rule, it is almost telling you, think of quantum states as something prior to probability assignments. They're logically prior because I calculate probabilities from these other objects. It's not that I calculate these other objects by the probabilities unless you go through some elaborate scenario like I did. I think Harvey Brown put it the clearest recently. He wrote a paper, his own paper about QBism for the most part, and he talks about no-go theorems. What John Bell in 1966 and Koshin and Specker in 67 independently proved that non-contextual hidden variable theories are inconsistent. There was little to indicate that such a result was likely within the prior literature on the foundations of quantum mechanics. The post-2012 no-go results concerning Einstein's psi-epistemic position, impressive as they are, surely are not as surprising. So there were arguments that quantum states were of the character of information or knowledge, apparently as of 1912, but he says surely not as surprising. Powerful plausibility arguments have long been available, some since the birth of quantum mechanics, to the effect that the quantum state is something real. They almost all have to do with the fact that the wave function in its relation to probability is strictly a generally complex probability amplitude. The quantum state, it, has more structure than a probability distribution does. Now, I think that tracks well with this view of what the Born rule is. If a QBist wants to defend himself against, say, Harvey, then it's our duty, actually, to try to give a sense, in a general sense, of exactly how this thing is not a law of nature in the usual sense of taking a property and a property and coming up with a probability, but rather as a normative relation. E.T. Jaynes gave guidance again, even on this. Of course, the quantum mechanical formalism also contains fundamentally important and correct ontological elements. It seems that to unscramble the epistemological probability statements from the ontological elements, we need to find a different formalism. One isomorphic in some sense, but based on different variables. It was only through some weird mathematical accident that it was possible to find a variable psi which scrambles them up in the present way. So Jaynes made a call, find a new formalism. QBism takes it seriously. Can we find a formalism that will in some way instantiate the idea that the Born rule is a normative statement? So my group, and my group for this reason, other groups for many other reasons, have been looking for a good formalism that would get rid of quantum states thought of as complex vectors in a vector space or as operators on a complex space, and instead replace quantum states with just pure probability assignments. And then, for those of us who have a bone to pick, I'll work up the nerve to go to Harvey. Harvey's a big man. He's a gentle, gentle bear, but he's a big man. And I would like to go up to Harvey and say, it has more structure than a probability distribution does, you say? But here it is. It's just a probability distribution, and in a nice formalism. So let me just show you a little bit of that effort. The way to pull it off is to imagine that there's a fiducial or standard measurement that we could put in the Bureau of Standards outside of Paris. Along with the standard kilogram and standard ruler stick, we could put something now called the standard quantum measurement. And what I would like as a property for the standard quantum measurement is that if we have a quantum state prepared in, a quantum system prepared in some quantum state rho, if I knew the probabilities for the outcomes of that measurement, then I would like the measurement to be so informative, so powerful, that knowing the probabilities alone, I can repredict what the quantum state was to begin with. So if I can do that, then I can replace the formalism of using quantum states with just purely a probability distribution. It takes more than the theory of von Neumann to get such a measurement. You can't use the standard orthogonal quantum measurements. You have to use something that we use in quantum information theory for the ones who aren't embedded in quantum information theory, called a generalized measurement or a positive operator valued measure. But there is a clear-cut candidate within that theory for what would be the standard quantum measurement, and I don't really want to explain it to you. But there's a good measurement that one could use exactly for this purpose. If you know the probabilities for the outcomes of this measurement, it will tell you what the quantum state is, and the formula from going from quantum state to probability and probability to quantum state is just a trivial little formula. Without knowing the details of it, suppose such a thing existed. One that I didn't want to explain to you. Just suppose such a thing existed. Then you could use it in the following kind of scenario. Suppose that you consider a regular measurement, like the ones that we learned in elementary quantum mechanics, a von Neumann measurement, and we have a quantum system that we're going to throw into that measuring device, and then its pointer is going to register the measurement outcome, so it's going to point in some direction, and I'll call that outcome J, or maybe D sub J. I could alternatively consider throwing my system not directly into this measuring device, but into the one in the Bureau of Standards. Ooh. And that one in the Bureau of Standards measures an outcome I. It's a different kind of measurement than this one, because I said I have to use the theory of generalized measurements up here, whereas this is just a regular one down here. And it will generate some outcome I. And suppose we ascribe the outcome I P of HI as its probability. And then we imagine it coming out of this device and falling down into the one down here again. There will be some conditional probabilities. What is the conditional probability of getting outcome J here, given that I got outcome I there? The kind of question you can ask is, well, what I really want to know is what is the probability of getting outcome J here if I throw it directly here? Can I calculate that number in terms of the probabilities for the measurement in the Bureau of Standards and the conditional probabilities for this measurement given the Bureau of Standards measurement? Well, this is quantum mechanics. So you're not going to be able to use the classical formula. Quantum mechanics gives you the Born rule, but the Born rule is in terms of quantum states and measurement operators. But if you transcribe the Born rule into this language, you find, for that very special measurement that I showed you on the other page, indeed you don't get this, but you get this. You get what we would have thought of as the classical rule, but modified just ever so slightly to get the quantum probabilities. So the one on the left refers to throwing the object directly into the bottom measuring device. The formulas on the right refer to throwing it into the one in the Bureau of Standards and then conditioning and throwing it further into the one on the ground. You get a formula that connects one set of probabilities with a different set of probabilities. Once you have the Born rule in this form, then it's natural for a subjective Bayesian to say, what quantum mechanics is proposing to us is a new normative rule above and beyond the old law of total probability that we get purely out of coherence. There's something about the world that makes it best for us to try to make gambles in this experiment consistent with gambles in the other experiment according to this formula. Okay, so Tenet 1 leads us in the direction of trying to find a formalism that would make the Born rule look like a normative rule in a rather natural way. Tenet 1. Tenet number 2, all probabilities, including all quantum probabilities, are so subjective they never tell nature what to do. This includes probability 1 assignments. Quantum states thus have no ontic hold on the world. So what do I mean by this? In a lot of developments of quantum foundations, one sees something called the eigenstate eigenvalue rule, is that what it's called? Link, eigenstate eigenvalue link. And the idea there is if you have a quantum state and you consider an observable that has the quantum state as one of its elements, then you go so far as to say, well, the quantum system has a property, and this basis, it's namely that. It's the one that lines up with this. So a probability 1 statement has the force within it to say that there is a property out there. For QBism, that's not the case. For QBism, we ask, well, what is the very meaning of probability 1? Well, the very meaning of probability 1 is that you would buy or sell this lottery ticket worth $1 if E for, in fact, $1. And that's all probability 1 means for it. Adán Cabello, for instance, might be so sure of something, so very sure of the faith of his dog. Do you have a dog?
No.
Oh, you should have a dog. If he had a dog, he might be so sure of its faith in him that he would gamble everything he had on the proposition, when you come to the door, the dog will come up to you lovingly. He'd say, yes, of course. And I say, is there any doubt in your mind? No, no, no. How much would you gamble on that? $1,000? Oh, yes. He loves his dog. And he comes up, maybe $1,000's not much, $100,000. He has so much trust in his dog. And he comes up to the door and the dog barks. No matter how much he believed that it would never bark, it barked. Well, that's because his belief doesn't force the world to do whatever it's going to do. How might you use that? Well, consider the EPR criterion of reality. If without in any way disturbing a system, one can predict something with certainty, i.e. with probability equal to unity, the value of a physical quantity, then there exists an element of physical reality corresponding to this physical quantity. If without in any way disturbing a system, one can gather the information required to predict with certainty, probability equal to unity, the value of a physical quantity, then there exists an element of physical reality corresponding to this physical quantity. Tim Maudlin, I think, codified it very nicely in, might have been the paper that I quoted earlier. Anyway, he says, if I could make one change to the EPR paper in retrospect, it would be to alter the characterization of this criterion. The authors call it reasonable, and in agreement with classical as well as quantum mechanical ideas of reality, but its status is actually much stronger than that. The criterion is, in the parlance of philosophers, analytic. That is, this criterion follows just from the very meanings of the words used in it. So he uses that to say this proposition, this notion of the EPR criterion of reality is so sound, there's no way to violate it because it's made true by the very meaning of the words in it. Then the argument goes, if the EPR criterion of reality is true, then having an entangled state alone implies that there must be an element of reality because you can predict something with certainty. So if you make the assumption of locality, then there must be an element of reality. And having an element of reality says that there must be a local hidden variable theory, and a local hidden variable theory will lead to a Bell inequality, and quantum mechanics violates the Bell inequality. That's the way the reasoning goes. So it's not that it's not analytic, it must be non-local. But in QBism, it's not analytic. And the reason it's not analytic is because he says, when he says it's made true by the very meanings of the words used in it, one of the words used in it is probability 1. And a QBist would say, you have too narrow of a view of probability 1. You didn't consider Di Finetti's theorem, where probability 1 means something very different than you usually think. So the value of this is that by adopting tenet number 2, we get rid of the standard argument for non-locality. So let's consider what happens when Alice makes a measurement on one side of an entangled system. She measures 1/2 of an EPR pair, and she updates, based on the measurement outcome here, her quantum state for there. What does that mean? Well, from the QBist point of view, all it means is if she were to walk to the other side and measure this same observable, she would gamble her life on getting that outcome, just like Adon would gamble his life on his dog demonstrating love when he walks up to the door. So there's nothing more to say. I'll just leave it at that. Tenet 3. Quantum measurement outcomes just are personal experiences for the agent gambling upon them. Particularly, quantum measurement outcomes are not, to paraphrase Bohr, instances of, and I made up this is not a direct quote of Bohr, but I've read so much Bohr, I kind of compacted it. They're not instances of irreversible amplification in devices whose design is communicable in common language, suitably refined by the terminology of classical physics. We want to say measurement outcomes just are personal experiences without having a measuring device out there in the world to mediate what is a measurement outcome. Think about this, a modern day version of the EPR argument. We have a maximally entangled state of 2 Q-trits, and we can consider making one or another measurement on the left side of one. If we invoke the EPR criterion of reality, then we can say, if I get outcome 2 for the left-hand observable, I can predict with certainty that I will get element 2 for the right-hand observable. And the EPR criterion of reality would say, therefore, there's an element of reality corresponding to that outcome. Alternatively, we could consider some non-commuting observable and say for this one too, we also get outcome 2. Then we can predict with certainty outcome 2 over here, therefore there's an element of reality, and everybody knows the story that EPR argued that quantum mechanics is incomplete because quantum mechanics doesn't give you the power of saying there are elements of reality associated with the outcomes. Until Cauchy and Specker came along. And I should say, by the way, this variant of Cauchy and Specker is a combination of Cauchy and Specker and Bell's type considerations because it also considers a maximally entangled state. To my knowledge, that argument was first made by Alan Stairs around 1980 or 1981, and I should have a big fat picture of Alan here, but this slide's incomplete. But anyway, that's basically Alan's kind of argument, combining the two with Cauchy and Specker. So they showed that if there really were these elements of reality, then every configuration of orthogonal triples should be colorable in a consistent way. And in fact, they're not. So there's something that breaks down. Now, in the Tim Maudlin quote, he would tell us locality has broken down. But for a QBist, we wouldn't want to say that locality is broken down. So really what is broken down is the assumption of a given set of colors for the all possible triples. And particularly, we have to admit to ourselves that the process of measurement makes something. It creates something, to use language like Miguel was using earlier. So from the QBist point of view, this kind of thinking, or in John Bell's thinking, the great lesson of John Bell for QBism is not that nature is non-local, but that nature is creative, that something is made in the measurement process. I was feeling poetic one day, so I wrote it this way. With every quantum measurement set by an experimenter's free will, the world is shaped just a little as it takes part in a moment of creation. So too it is with every action of every agent everywhere, not just experimenters in laboratories. Quantum measurement represents those moments of creation that are sought out or noticed. So here was my first foray into an ontology for QBism. It's that creation is happening all over, everywhere. But quantum theory doesn't concern the acts of creation that are ongoing everywhere. It concerns how we are gambling on the ones that involve us. So let me look at EPR again from this point of view. The story of EPR is that making a measurement here doesn't create an element, it doesn't imply that there's an element of reality. From Koshin and Specker, we learn that making a measurement here doesn't even reveal an element of reality. It must be that making a measurement here creates something. It creates something here. You take an action on this quantum system, and a new experience is created. And then you say, given that experience, what do I expect if I were to walk over there and take another action? I would gamble my life now. It doesn't mean that making the creation here created something there. Instead, it just means here's an act of creation that I didn't have a fixed opinion on. Here's another action that I do have a fixed opinion on, and I'm willing to gamble my life. Tenet 4. A measurement apparatus is conceptually an extension of the agent. It should be considered analogous to a sense organ or a prosthetic limb, simultaneously a tool and a part of the individual. This is a play on, it's not a play on anything. This is QBism's view. A measurement apparatus is conceptually an extension of the agent. Here's something John Bell wrote. In the beginning, natural philosophers tried to understand the world around them. Trying to do that, they hit upon the great idea of contriving artificially simple situations in which the number of factors involved is reduced to a minimum. Divide and conquer. Experimental science was born, but experiment is a tool. The aim remains to understand the world. You do experiments to understand the world. To restrict quantum mechanics to be exclusively about piddling laboratory operations is to betray the great enterprise. A serious formulation will not exclude the big world outside of the laboratory. My colleague David Merman says, so true, we have to reply to Bell. And the way we reply to him is, yes, quantum mechanics doesn't only concern piddling laboratory operations. It's about taking actions on the world and eliciting consequences for yourself. Those actions on the world might be like this stupid person I once saw run across Étoile. She gambled her life in taking the run across the street. So an action can be anything from running across the street à l'Étoile to a sophisticated quantum information experiment. In taking actions by running across l'Étoile, one is probably not using not using probability theory at all. But if she wanted to make better decisions, it would have been in her interest to take a little time and use probability theory. Would it be in her best interest to invoke quantum theory for running across the road? Well, it probably wouldn't be, and it's probably not worth her time. But when it comes to doing sophisticated quantum information experiments, then it's worth your time to use the tools put in front of you by quantum theory. Conceptually, the lab experiment, so this is Ronald Hansen, right? I believe? I think. I love the way it looks like he's putting a karate chop on the lab table. Conceptually, the lab equipment is really part of the agent from the point of view of QBism. How does this compare to Copenhagen views? I'm almost finished, Adam, so don't tell me to get off the stage yet. I started 2 minutes late anyway. So here's something that Pauli wrote to Niels Bohr in a 1955 letter. He described something, and then he said, this question shows Einstein's concern that the objective character of physics might be lost through a theory of the type of quantum mechanics. The objectivity of physics is, however, fully ensured in quantum mechanics in the following sense. Although in principle, according to the theory, it is in general only the statistics of series of experiments that is determined by laws, the observer is unable, even in the unpredictable single case, to influence the result of his observation, as, for example, the response of a counter at a particular instant of time. Further, personal qualities of the observer do not come into the theory in any way. This is the important part. The observation can be made by objective registering apparatus, the results of which are objectively available for anyone's inspections. So in the language that I used this morning, as far as Pauli was concerned, the outcomes of quantum measurement were facts for everybody. QBism says, no, they're facts for the agent. They are not objectively available for anyone's inspection. So that's one level in which we say that the apparatus is part of the observer. Another level has to do with the diagram that I showed you before. If one takes the formulation of the Born rule seriously, you no longer give, as a description of a measurement, operators, E sub I, and use the Born rule, trace rho E sub I. The description of the measurement is in terms of probabilities themselves. And what would a subjective Bayesian say about conditional probabilities as opposed to unconditioned probabilities? A subjective Bayesian would say, probabilities are not facts of the world. They are my degrees of belief. Compare or contrast that to the way Niels Bohr would draw measuring devices, these big, heavy objects bolted to the laboratory tables so that they're very stable and very heavy. Especially in his later papers, he would emphasize that laboratory equipment was heavy, and therefore one doesn't use the quantum description for it. If you take this point of view seriously, this one, that a measuring device is specified in terms of probabilities, and you take it very seriously that probabilities are always, by their nature, subjective, what is one to make of Niels Bohr's very heavy, bolted down measuring devices? For a qubist, they are conditional probabilities just like anything else. So rather than being more solid than a quantum system, from the qubist perspective, they are just like a quantum system. They are probability assignments. I'm going to skip this, and I might come back to that. What might QBism be telling us about the nature of reality? I'll just say the main thing that really gets me going, and the reason I like this point of view that 5, 6, 7 of us have been developing in physics, is because it instantiates something that thrills me, like the old horror movies on Saturday night used to thrill me when I was a kid, but in a positive way. This is Will Durant on William James's philosophy. The value of this conception of the universe lies in this, that where there are cross currents and warring forces, our own strength and will may count and help decide the issue. It is a world where nothing is irrevocably settled. So if there aren't stabilized facts underneath everything, but we're always gambling on a world in creation. It is a world where nothing is irrevocably settled and all action matters. A monistic world is for us a dead world In such a universe, we carry out willy-nilly the parts assigned to us by an omnipotent deity or a primeval nebula. And not all our tears can wipe out one word of the eternal script. In a finished universe, individuality is a delusion. In reality, the monist assures us, we are all bits of one mosaic substance. But in an unfinished world, one like quantum theory indicates to QBism, in an unfinished world, we can write some lines of the parts we play, and our choices mold in some measure the future in which we have to live. In such a world, we can be free. It is a world of chance and not of fate. Everything is not quite, and what we are or do may alter everything. So that's QBism from the point of view of 5 humans and 1 little dog. Thank you.
So, since you read a lot of things by Tim Maudlin, maybe I can
Sorry?
ask. So I have a question about Tim Maudlin kind of analysis of the EPR program. And I always wonder if it is consistent at all. And what they use usually in this argument is in order to establish the elements of reality, there is some notion of locality they use because there is no disturbance of this on distance because it's performed on distant locations. So there is some notion of locality that is assumed from which they can derive elements of reality, and then in a chain of reasoning, after violation of Bell inequalities, they would conclude that the world is non-local, starting from locality. So I wonder if this is consistent at all, and furthermore, either it is such a strong argument that is analytic, as he writes, but then compared exactly when you apply this argument in the situation that you had, where you have kind of a deterministic argument, where you have this Kochen-Speckert EPR combination, you cannot even establish elements of reality, and then the answer will be, well, because there is no locality. But the argument is then not analytic. You cannot even establish. Either you can establish elements of reality because it's so obvious it follows from the meaning of the words, or you assume no locality. You can't have both of them. But that's okay. I don't know what you feel about that, but I guess we are on the same side. But what I always wonder about now QBism is the following.
So we were on the same side. Now we're about to.
Now we are.
Now we're going to start to push against each other.
So the probabilities are personal, and there is no preference to any of them, to any agents. They are all symmetric. Now, and so there are no more objective probabilities in a sense when we compare all probability assignment of different agents. Now, in a standard physical situation, I'm not talking about Wigner friends. Usually we have a situation where somebody has quite a good control of the preparation of the state. And maybe he is preparing a state and maybe checks stability of the state and has some confidence about the state. And conditional on his knowledge, he can make statements. Now, there are other agents that maybe do not have an access or only partial access to the preparation procedure. Now, the fact that they have different probability assignment, and furthermore, that in every possible gambling, with respect to the future experimental results, the one who has a control of the preparation procedure will have better chances to win. Does this indicate, or why it shouldn't indicate, according to your view, that his probability assignments are to a certain degree more objective than the others?
Yes. Rüdiger Schack has a beautiful answer to that.
Well, if you like.
I mean, if you can do it as eloquently as you did it the other night, when we were practicing for you.
I probably can't. But, I mean, the key is in the notion that probabilities are not descriptive, but they're normative. So the idea is that the quantum formalism gives you tools. I mean, but how did you say it? You strive for consistency. It's so the formalism doesn't give you a fixed rule of what probability should assign, but it gives you a consistency criteria. And so, in the following sense, I have no doubt that there are better and less good probabilities, because somebody who works harder for his probabilities, of course, in that sense, they will be better. I mean, I would, let's say I'm a third person and there are two agents in front of me. One is just, and I ask them, well, how did you get your probabilities? And one says, well, I just wrote them down. And the other one says, well, and then he gives your argument, he has worked very, very hard for them. And there's no doubt that for that reason, these are better, because he has worked harder, he has strived harder, and he has taken into account more.
Just add something to that. And you cannot work harder than that, because if you know this, and you have a pure state assignment, you know, in a sense, the most what quantum mechanics allows. So you cannot do it harder. So this relativize this.
I mean, I don't think that any experimenter would agree with that. You can always work harder, and you can always take more into account, and can look and can look for more. But I don't think there's any more than that.
Let's try to put it this way. I want to expand on what Rudiger's saying. What is being said here is that there are no external criterion for determining whether one assignment is better than the other. Within any given agent, the agent can say, it's probably going to rain tomorrow. Let me make a 90% probability. But he knows that he's not doing as best as he could, because the whole point of the coherence idea of probability is he had better make sure that the way he would be willing to gamble. I mean, these are not empty statements. If you say 99% chance of rain tomorrow, the idea is you are willing to put down a certain amount of money. So unless you're so insane that you're willing to throw away all of your money, it's in your best interest to make an assignment that you feel good about. So a cheap and easy assignment is 99% chance of rain, but you can lose a lot of money. You know to yourself that if you take into account what you also believe about the weather patterns, what you also believe about global warming, what you also believe about how reliable your roof is, if you also take into account all of these beliefs, and then just like in mathematical logic, you have to make sure that they all fit together. If you have a set of propositions and you look at some ands and ors and so forth, and you find you get a false value somewhere, or you find an inconsistency, then something's got to be adjusted, and you know that, or you're going to make a mistake in your calculation. So this I don't believe is going to satisfy you, but you shouldn't give up. You shouldn't give up. So the point is, within a given agent, there is a notion of better or worse. Now, you say, well, God looks down upon the two agents, and God says, well, I can see he worked harder and he didn't, so therefore he's better, or he gets the numbers right. But we don't allow a third-person perspective. So there's no one to come down and judge. If we did have someone to judge, we'd say, well, how is he judging? Oh, he's using his own priors. Where did he get those? He got those out of a big mesh of consistency. So the judging of this one being better than that depends upon a higher level of a subjective assignment to begin with. Then one would have to say, well, is he doing the best job he could? We've got to put in a third referee who looks down on all the referees, and you get an infinite regress. What Bayesianism does, subjective Bayesian says, is, look, you don't have access to those things. What you've got access to are the beliefs that you've got and the ability to make them consistent if you can. And we'll continue this over a glass of wine.
So I think I'm missing one additional tenet that you may want to include in the future, which is the following. So if you, I guess you agree that there are different agents, and we're talking about that, and of course QBism is subjective and personal, but nevertheless, let's say I make a statement, for example, I make a prediction for the weather tomorrow, and you know that I'm a good QBist and I did all the calculations right, then you somehow would like to have probably an updating rule which allows you to take into account what I tell you. Let's say I tell you tomorrow it's going to rain with 99% probability, and I did the calculations and so on, and I did it according to all the best I could, the Bayesian rules. Mm-hmm. Then you should be able to somehow take into account that statement that I'm making without modeling me as a quantum system, because that seems to be irrelevant at this point. I'm just making a statement as a QBist, so to speak. So the specific question is there, or why it seems there is no such updating rule. So there is no updating rule which tells me how I should deal with knowledge by other agents communicating to me, how I can somehow update my own knowledge, except for treating that agent as a quantum system, but that would be probably unrealistic.
No, I mean,
you may not even know that. So the question is, do you want to have such a rule and add such a tenet, or is there good reason not to have it?
No, there's no good reason not to have it. Because we do this all the time.
Yes.
I have a favorite weatherman. I really do. NBC News Boston. I don't trust the other guys. This one guy I really like, and I pay attention to what he tells me. And so I take his degrees of belief and incorporate them into mine. To some extent, probably to a lesser extent, I incorporate my wife's degrees of belief into my own. And so we do this all the time. And the deep, dark, dirty details of Bayesian statistics has to encompass this sort of thing. How it is that we incorporate, well, it all has to do with, for instance, how much I believe you, how much I think you are reliable. So I have an opinion about something, but I also have degrees of belief about you. And I might have, I hate to imagine this, but imagine Donald Trump was in this room, and he says, "Believe me," as he often says. Well, I wouldn't believe him, but I might believe you. But that depends upon my own assessment of things. So I don't believe that there can be an overall thing that just says take this belief and that belief and incorporate them in one fixed way. The way that I would incorporate what you believe and what I believe will depend upon what I also believe about you. So this is a big, hard problem, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it doesn't play a part of the conceptual foundation of the theory. So one of the reasons I got close to Jeff Kimball's lab. He would never let me in it. But there are people in there working, twiddling, doing things, and Kimball comes up and says, "No, you've done that wrong. You need to do something." And they incorporate his opinions into what they do, because it's probably a good thing to do, and it helps accelerate the pace with which they can do the quantum teleportation experiment, say. And that's quantum mechanical. So they're incorporating his degrees of belief into what they're doing in the laboratory in an attempt to make what? To make that? No, from our point of view, they're incorporating his degrees of belief to make a good one of those. And that is the proxy for the solid-heavy object. So I don't know whether it should be a tenet, but it's certainly a live issue. It's just not part of the conceptual foundation.
Can I add something to that?
No.
No. I really should.
I have 15 questions.
There is a very simple reason why it can't be an extra tenet. This is because that other guys' probabilities depend on his prior as well as on him taking everything into account. Therefore, it cannot be an actual rule, a fixed rule. But on the other hand, there are plenty of actual approaches to specifically taking into account other people's probability distributions. Things exist, but they cannot be a tenet.
At the beginning, you talked about the project of QBism as separating the wheat from the chaff, determining what's subjective and what's subjective and what's objective in quantum theory. And then you mentioned that, I guess generally speaking, elements are subjective, relations are objective. And then you talked about the Born rule as being as constituting some kind of normative relation.
Yeah.
And my question is, do the relations that physical reality gives to us, are they exhausted by normative relations, or do you think there are also descriptive relations that can be isolated?
Okay. I was going to draw an equation, but I don't need to, I guess. You see, so for instance, the Born rule, I was having a conversation with a structural realist one day, and I was trying to not be laughed at. And I kept saying that I viewed the Born rule as objective, normative, but objective nonetheless. And so I was shocked that the change in notation made all the difference. So I took this equation that I showed here. I think this is relevant for answering your next question. Where did that equation go? Oh, I took this equation as it appeared here and replaced this term here with a big black dot. And I replaced that term with a big black dot. And that term with a big black dot, but left it otherwise the same. Can you imagine that? Big black dot here, big black dot there. And what I wanted to try to convey was, imagine that you go poof, and you're out of the picture now. Then those probabilities that you had put in those placeholders would also disappear. But the idea of the normative relation, that if I were on the scene and I did want to do the best gambling, then I should try to take my subjective assignments and make them fit those slots. So that's the sense in which I want to think that normative relations are objective, at least this one. You can do the same thing for unitary evolution. So there's a whole... So it's not just the Born rule. You can also do it for unitarity. Are there other relations, non-normative ones, but descriptive ones, that are also objective? And I don't know. And that's the thing. You know, for instance, there are certainly other pieces of our experience and of life that we're not using quantum mechanics for, never have used quantum mechanics for. Should the relations in those, you know, if we can find some, should they be considered objective? And I don't have a good answer for you. Just talking about quantum mechanics here.
I had a question about tenet number 4. I'm not sure I understand entirely how it fits with. Well, why is it important in the framework of QBism? So the idea that the measurement apparatus is an extension of the agent. So the first question is, why is it important? And the second is, like, how do you cope with the fact that there are like infinitely many measurements on the same system? So do you mean that every time we set up an experiment, we make a different extension of ourselves, or it means that we have all of them in principle?
So you don't understand why it's important.
Why should it be a tenet?
Okay. And there are two reasons. Maybe I didn't express it so well, but suppose that we all went poof, all of us. From the subjective Bayesian view, are there any probabilities whatsoever left in the world? From a subjective Bayesian point of view, there's none. So if I go poof, all the probability all the gambling tables, they all go poof too, if we all do. Okay. If you take this point of view about this is a measurement, seriously. The measurement is given purely by a set of conditional probabilities. By someone. Let's say me. So I've been in the laboratory, I've worked. The way I work to calibrate things is I assume some things are exchangeable, and I take into account my estimates of how much the ground's going to be wobbling, because of a big trucks going. There's so many things you've got to take into account. Ultimately, all of that calibration and so forth turns into something we call a measuring device. From the conceptual point of view, that measuring device is a big probability distribution. So already at that level, at the level of purely subjective Bayesianism, this thing that we thought was out there, an objective fact, an objective arrangement that we could communicate to anybody and so forth. From our point of view, it's just a firmly held conditional probability assignment. And so, at least in that sense, it's an extension of the agent, because it's his probability assignment. The other reason has to do more with analyzing the Wigner-Frenz scenario of this issue. If you took Pauli seriously, that a measuring device is objective measuring apparatus and the outcomes are there for anyone to see, then how do you deal with Wigner's friend? That's the question that is going to occupy 3 talks tomorrow morning, I think. And so our way of opting out of that is to say, this thing that we've always thought is an objective piece of measuring apparatus and anyone can walk up to it and look at what is on it, we say, no, it's not. It was always a proxy for the observer's private experience to begin with. It just wasn't recognized as such. So there are 2 reasons for thinking of the measuring for Tenet 4. One is to do with Wigner's friend, and one is to do with this point of view that measurements are, strictly speaking, conditional probability assignments.
So it's fair to say that what you mean is that also measurements are, whereas for states we already believe that. I mean, I couldn't see what is special about measurements in this anyways. Because we could say the same about states, evolutions, and measurements. Oh,
I do. I emphasize they're all on the same logical footing.
Okay.
Unitary operations, Hamiltonians, everything is on the same logical footing except for structural relations, like the Born rule or the Schrödinger equation, which actually in this formalism is identical to the Born rule. So if you work out what unitary time evolution looks like in this language, it connects initial probabilities to final probabilities by what equation? Exactly the Born rule.
Thanks.
Okay.
I want to put Czeslav's and Renato's questions together. Renato asked about updating rule for taking account of other agents' knowledge. But one thing that people sometimes meant by Bayesianism is a view according to which one should update one's probabilities according to a certain rule. Probabilities when, in this context, not getting information about other agents' knowledge, but other agents, but just yourself repeating the same, what you take to be the same experiment, you're getting more and more statistics. So wouldn't I would expect Bayesian to say, yeah, there is an updating rule for probabilities, which should be applied when you get more statistics. So the rational thing to do is not just to make all of your present beliefs consistent, but to get more data. And as the more data come in, then I'm updating my beliefs in this according to this rule, and eventually, perhaps my beliefs will get updated in such a way that I'll completely change my mind about what the quantum state was, but now my quantum state will reflect the statistics I'm getting, and I hope to continue to get. So is there a Bayesian updating rule for incorporating new information based on additional experimental repetitions?
Well, that's a loaded question because it's called Bayes' rule, and or Bayesian conditionalizing.
Right.
And for some amount of history, Bayesians thought that rule was as objective as coherence itself.
Right.
And then Ian Hacking came along, and Bas van Frossen came along, and they pointed out that there are instances where one might not want to conditionalize. That if you tried to give a Dutch book argument like you can for coherence, but for diachronic consistency, then there is no strictly valid Dutch book argument for diachronic consistency. And you can identify the conditions under which you would want to use Bayesian conditioning. And Bas has done this, and I guess other people have done it as well. But basically it boils down to an assumption that you so trust your prior that as you get data, it doesn't compel you to throw away your prior. It says, just improve on me, just conditionalize on me. But every now and then you see something that so changes your world view that you say, I'm not just going to improve. It's not in my best interest to just improve on my old prior. I'm better off to just throw it away and start again. And that's what diachronic coherence misses. It's not able to capture that more general situation. So just as there is conditionalizing is good under certain circumstances, if you're absolutely sure that your previous opinion is just as good as it's going to get, then you can use Bayesian updating. Similarly, in quantum mechanics, when you perform a measurement, you might use the collapse rule. So that's something like Bayesian conditioning. And under certain circumstances, you might want to use that. But we know in quantum information theory that there are plenty of other situations where you won't use the usual collapse rule. So it's that. So the updating rule doesn't have the same status as a synchronic coherence. Diachronic coherence is more problematic. So I haven't wanted to take that as part of the story or an extra tenet. Tenet 5, we use a Bayesianly expressed collapse rule. I haven't wanted to take that as a tenet.
That's the collapse rule. But for just getting more and more statistics, we're repeating the same experiment. Many Bayesians in that situation who don't want to throw out their whole framework of ideas would want to say, and now my degrees of belief are tracking the frequencies better as I continue to update in this way.
So John Smolin, being weird John Smolin, used to fantasize about whether there was a faraway planet that was populated by a civilization he called the anti-inductivists. And the anti-inductivists, when they see a coin come up heads, they say, it's more likely to be a tail next time. And if they see two heads in a row, they say it's still more likely to be a tail the next time. And so forth and so on. He wondered whether this could be consistent and whether one might model this behavior in Bayesian terms. So he asked the question, and then Rudiger Schack, being very good at mathematics, found a prior that had exactly this probability. So it is a presumption that given data leads to tighter statistics. The assumption of exchangeability, for instance, will tell you that in the long run you'll converge with high probability to a given frequency. So that's one case where you sort of expect, looking at the data improves. But if you really had a weird mindset, you could model the opposite behavior in Bayesian probability theory, an anti-inductivist behavior. So that we use as a counterexample to the idea that looking at more data always leads to a convergence of opinion. You can construct situations where two people can be looking at data, and rather than coming into agreement, they start diverging in agreement. We see this in American politics, at the very least. But you can actually give a real model, and Rudiger and I have one in a paper. You should cut it off. Everybody is
No, because the chairman has a lot of questions to me. Bad luck. I told you I don't want it to be the chairman. So.
Yes. Why do you insist on the SIG QBMs? This is something I
This is one of my questions.
So I mean, does it really matter? Why can't you just state the density matrix? I mean, it has a very nice set of rules. I know it's appealing to have probabilities, but does it really matter for the thing that you want to say, or why does it matter?
It depends upon which level you ask this. So, as far as tenets number 1, 2, 3, 4, each one of those could be said in terms that never involve SIG POVMs. And in fact, of the 5 humans and 1 dog on the front page, David Merman is very unsympathetic to the SIG POVM program. And then of one of the other humans, if I characterize him properly, Rudiger Schack, I think so. The SIG POVM program is nice and it's pleasant, but it's not essential, and that that by introducing it always in my talks, perhaps I confuse the essential issues in people's minds. So I have to agree with them, it's not essential. If what you care about is the status quo, if you just care about the consistency of the view, then it's not essential. But if you want to push a deeper program, so now I'm speaking for myself, not any of the other 5, including QBism the dog. Well, I should tell you guys where QBism the dog came from. My daughter had been wanting a dog and begging for a dog, and then she saw this one on the internet. He was born in Tennessee, and she wanted to rescue him. And she said, if I could get this dog, I would name him Q, just the letter Q. And, you know, if you'll support me in getting him, you can give him his middle name. So I was like, I couldn't turn it down. So he is QBism. She usually calls him Q. I usually call him Bism. What I think, so if you want to push the theory further, then I think it is in our best interest to find some statement that does away with these confusing quantum states and only has probabilities. So as I say, I used Harvey as a foil. I'd like to say, look, Harvey, I'm going to show you that a quantum state really doesn't have more in it than probability. It's just a single probability assignment. There's no amplitudes, there's nothing different except for an extra normative rule.
But it's not a simplex, there's not a probability in any way. I mean, however you put it, you can't, I mean, you make a linear transformation from the states to another space, which happens to have be positive numbers between 0 and 1, but still your possible set of probabilities is not a simplex, therefore it's not a probability.
No, I wouldn't say that. I can put a restriction on the simplex anytime. In economics, I can say, look, I'm using probability theories, but because of how I view exchange rates and so forth, I know that it would be stupid to use probability assignments over in this corner and that corner or another corner, and I draw a convex set and I say, these are the reasonable ones. It's probability theory with an extra restriction. And so from this point of view, quantum state space is probabilities with an extra restriction,
Sure, yes.
and then an extra normative rule. Okay, but let me quickly answer the technical one, so we can continue to debate that. But why the SIG POVMs? You could just introduce, and Marcus has asked this before. You could just introduce any informationally complete measurement, and you can play your game. And that's true, if all I was concerned about was just the game. But if I just drew up any informationally complete measurement, the ones that were allowed, that were easily allowed me, then they wouldn't have much, they themselves wouldn't be very restrictive. But what if I insist on this particular way of writing the Born rule? This particular way of writing the Born rule can only happen if SIG POVMs exist. So if I take this as my fundamental postulate, it looks clean and it looks simple, but it's sneaking in the very existence of SIG POVMs. And the idea is, if SIG POVMs must exist in the space, immediately we can say it's not real vector space quantum mechanics, it's not quaternionic vector space quantum mechanics, It's some very, very particular structure. So really, why I like sick POVMs is it sneaks a lot in. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing. That's the idea.
Three of my questions were related to Matthias' questions.
Oh, good. Knock 3 out.
But notice that when you do that, there's something very uncomfortable with the expression, which is a dimension that suggests that the dimension of the system is something objective, or is more objective than other things. And within this framework,
Yeah, we practiced our answer to Chaslov, and we practiced our answer to you.
Okay.
And now Rudiger Schock's going to answer. Where did it go? Yes, so at times in the past I have committed a sin of saying that the dimension captures the zing of a quantum system. It's the thing that plays the role in this theory like mass for a cannonball plays a role. It tells you what you can do with it. And Adon has always come along and said, but really there's a sense in which dimension is not an objective feature. And I have always agreed with him. I don't know if he has known that I've agreed with him. But I've also had a disagreement too. So the way I usually try to say it is, suppose we're talking about a probability assignment for a coin, whether the coin lands heads or tails. So I take it as the sample space that a coin can land heads or tails. And then I write down my subjective degrees of belief about whether it will, upon flipping it, will be heads or tails. Okay. The heads and tails represent something objective, how the coin can land. And the probability represents my degrees of belief about that objective feature of a coin, I might say. And then Adon says, no. There's more ways it can land than just heads or tails. Maybe the orientation, George Washington's head points this way or that way or the other way. So that proves to me that the coin being a bivalent, having two possible values, is not an objective feature of the coin. It's a subjective judgment that I only care about heads versus tails. So even the sample space is a subjective judgment for some physical situation. So then the point I make is that the sample space is a subjective judgment and the probabilities over the sample space are a subjective judgment. But once I fix the sample space, I act as if that's the objective fact, the size of it, and the probability distribution is the subjective part. But there's an underlying subjectivity in assigning the sample space. Then when we come to quantum mechanics, I say, it's the same thing. The Hilbert space dimension really is a subjective judgment. It actually connected to Manuel's talk very nicely when he was talking about Mead's point of view about what is an object. That you classify an object based on what you think you... I don't know if you use this language exactly, but what you think you can do with it. And so similarly, I would say this is when we were practicing. So we came up with the formulation that you assign a dimension based on what you think you can do with some quantum stuff. What's the range of preparations that you can give it? What's the range of measurements that you can give it? But that's a subjective statement. But once you make that subjective statement, then you treat it as a more objective affair than the quantum states themselves. So that's the best answer I can give you in this old.
Okay, then just the last one, the rest for the wine. Creation of what? Personal experiences, I guess.
He wanted to shut me up. I don't know how to answer that. Creation of what? I don't know. I mean, something else we were discussing in our week here. We have adopted, I used to call, in my old diagrams, you probably don't remember anymore, but I would show the guy with the measuring device hands, and then I would say, he takes an action, and that leads to a sensation. So I'd use the word sensation as a consequence of a measurement outcome. I didn't like the word sensation, so I wrote the word ouch. Like you touched something and it hurt you. So it was to convey the idea that you felt something. Then I got in the habit of calling the outcomes of quantum measurements the consequences of the actions. Much less committal. Consequences for me of the actions. And at some point I picked up the term experience. And when I did, David Merman said, "That's it! Experience!" And then he started taking note. And I guess feedback from father to son. When he liked experience, I started using experience a lot more. But I'm not sure that is the best word. It is the word that Dewey and James would use. Because they wanted to envision that the world was made of some, to speak like Karen did this morning, some basic ontological unit. And for them, they called the basic ontological unit pure experience. There's a certain similarity, just to mention Bill Dimopoulos' name again. Bill always suggested that I read Whitehead, and that in Whitehead's notion of prehensions, I would find this basic ontological unit that has the right flavor. And one of the key things about a prehension was that it had a certain inbuilt creativity and was helping create the world. So you asked me, create what? And I think the best answer I can give off the cuff is to create this and what we've got. Everyone should go get wine.